Long before astronauts walked on the moon, two American officers were already asking a far more difficult question about the space domain. Who would stand watch? It is August 1947. The United States Air Force won't officially exist for another 2 weeks. The Soviet Sputnik launch is still 10 years away. No human being has ever traveled into space. And yet everyday Americans are reading about orbital patrols, moon bases, and a permanent military organization in space in the pages of the popular Collier's magazine. The authors weren't flying officers. Instead, they were two naval officers who became friends at the United States Naval Academy as members of the class of 1929. They were World War II hero Captain Caleb Lanning and retired Lieutenant Robert Heinlein. Yes, that Robert Heinlein. Today we're going back to one of the most remarkable, yet most forgotten, documents in the history of military space. The Second World War had ended only 2 years earlier. Atomic weapons had transformed military strategy. Congress had passed the National Security Act of 1947, creating an independent United States Air Force. But the service would not officially come into existence until September 18, 1947. When the article Flight into the Future appeared in the August 30th edition of Collier's magazine, Americans read about military operations in space before the Air Force itself officially existed. But if history remembers the article at all, it is just as one of the many space articles Collier's published during the space age. But the space articles that Collier's produced that everyone remembers, those that popularized the art of Chelsea Bonestell and brought the name Werner von Braun into American homes, were first published beginning in 1952. Lanning and Heinlein preceded the space age by 5 entire years. But even more impressive, what they told the American people wasn't simply about how to get into space. They explained what America and the world should do when they got there. Instead of writing a technical paper involving the V-2 rockets the U.S. Army had just begun experimenting with in the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, Heinlein and Lanning instead invite the reader aboard a spacecraft. Not a capsule, not a prototype, a cruiser. The ship is the United Nations Space Patrol ship UNS Jupiter. The Jupiter had just departed moon base control and is relieving another patrol ship, the UNS Saturn, which had just completed its tour of duty in Earth orbit. The Jupiter is a nuclear-powered rocket of the UN Space Patrol with a crew of dozens. Its captain is a former U.S. Army Air Force jet bomber pilot. Its chief navigator is a British astronomer who joined the UN Space Patrol after serving at the famous Greenwich Observatory. The chief engineer is Brazilian. The mission commander is an inspector for the UN Atomic Commission and holds a PhD in physics. Russian, French, and Texan are just a few of the many accents heard throughout the ship. Already, this is a remarkable vision. The moon isn't an unexplored frontier. It holds a permanent military base under the direction of the UN Security Council. Spaceflight isn't a small, expensive experiment involving test pilots. It's routine. And the Jupiter isn't exploring. It's reporting for duty. The Jupiter's mission is to inspect, maintain, and command a constellation of orbital satellites with clusters of guided missiles armed with atomic warheads already deployed around the Earth. These aren't scientific satellites. They're armed strategic weapons. Heinlein and Lanning imagined a permanent orbital nuclear deterrent commanded by the United Nations and maintained by an international military space force of professional crews. The Jupiter's officers don't spend their time merely planting flags or conducting experiments. They inspect launch systems. They check weapons, perform maintenance, relieve previous crews, remain on constant alert to deter aggression anywhere on Earth, and ensure a new world war never happens. In other words, this is less an adventure story and more a description of strategic military operations in space. Think about what Heinlein and Lanning are asking their readers to imagine. Permanent military crews in orbit, a moon base serving as an operational headquarters, strategic nuclear weapons deployed in space, routine crew rotations, professional officers whose daily responsibilities involve maintaining the readiness of humanity's ultimate deterrent. This is not Buck Rogers. It's military doctrine presented through narrative. Neither author was an armchair dreamer. Lanning had commanded destroyers in combat and helped pioneer the Navy's Combat Information Center. Heinlein had served aboard the aircraft carrier Lexington before tuberculosis ended his naval career, though he later returned to wartime research at the Naval Aircraft Factory in World War II. Both knew Navy strategy and doctrine, as well as high technology. The Jupiter isn't treated like an airplane. It's a ship. It relieves another vessel on station. Its crew stands watches. It performs maintenance. It supports a permanent strategic presence in orbit. It is not a simple rocket or capsule. It is part of a dynamic human space fleet. Seen by itself, Flight into the Future is a fascinating example of creative military minds considering the new domain of outer space. But it's also the beginning of something larger. Only a year later, Heinlein published the juvenile science fiction novel Space Cadet, imagining the education and professional formation of officers serving in a permanent space patrol, almost exactly the same organization from Flight into the Future. Soon afterward came his short story The Long Watch, where a lone junior officer resists a military coup on the moon to hijack the patrol's nuclear deterrent and establish a worldwide military dictatorship. That story isn't really about rockets. It's about an officer willing to sacrifice his own life rather than allow unauthorized control of strategic nuclear weapons based on the moon. Taken together, these three works suggest that Heinlein wasn't simply imagining future technology. He was thinking about the institutions, responsibilities, and ethics required to govern military power beyond the Earth. In short, he was constructing the first concept of a space force. Today, we, including the U.S. Space Force, often think of military space as satellites for communication, navigation, reconnaissance, and other support activities. But before the Air Force officially existed, before Sputnik, before NASA, two friends from the Naval Academy, both professional naval officers, one destined to become a rear admiral and the other a science fiction grandmaster, in one of the nation's most popular magazines, described a permanent strategic military organization operating in space to perform one of the most important missions in the world, keeping the peace. Whether their vision was practical is another question. One of the questions this channel will explore in the future is not whether military visions for space like this were more ambitious than those that NASA achieved. They unquestionably were. The real question is whether landing in Heinlein's vision was genuinely beyond the capabilities of the first space age, or whether it was abandoned because the institutions making those decisions had become too cautious about what human beings could accomplish. No matter the answer, landing in Heinlein's vision and the remarkable ideas Flight into the Future introduced deserve to be remembered. And in future episodes, we'll explore how later military thinkers attempted to transform visions like these into reality. Because the history of military space did not begin with Sputnik. It began with ideas. Ideas written before anyone had seen Earth from orbit. If you enjoy exploring forgotten documents, overlooked strategic ideas, and the history of frontiers that shaped our world, from long-gone Rio Grande trade empires to humanity's next steps into the solar system, over land, sea, air, and space, please consider subscribing. I'm Brent Zarnick, and this is Frontiers of Power. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next frontier.